to another session of the Localized Green Talent Forum. Today, we're talking about green jobs and urban transformation, shaping healthy, sustainable communities. Um, um, Very excited to be having with us today Mokena Makeka and Courtney Keene. Mokena is an award-winning architect, urbanist, and global leader in sustainable design and development. Born in South Africa and raised in Lesotho and New York, he brings a unique international perspective to his work. Mokena holds a Bachelor of Architecture with honors from the University of Cape Town and has completed executive leadership programs at prestigious institutions, including Harvard Kennedy School of Business and Oxford University. Mokena, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. We also have Courtney Keene. Courtney is a seasoned strategy and management consultant with a focus on social impact and global development. Currently, she serves as a senior manager at Deloitte. She has extensive experience in developing and implementing strategies that align with programs and processes to achieve impactful development objectives. Courtney has worked closely with major international organizations, including the World Bank, USAID, and the US Department of State. And it's really cool to have somebody like Courtney here today because I think, a lot of the work currently happening in this space is through the big consulting companies. Courtney and Mokena, it's an absolute pleasure having you with us here today.
It's very good to be here. Thank you. Really excited to be part of the conversation and really excited to hear that everybody's so enthused by the topics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So for the participants that are here today, we have some questions. We'll be going through the discussions. Please feel free to put your comments on chat. A team member from Localize will be filtering through the comments on chat and will be feeding us the questions that we can ask. We will allocate some time towards the end of this session to make sure that we address any questions that are coming from our audience. To kick us off, I'm gonna just jump right in, and let's start with you, Courtney. Can you what emerging roles do you see in urban sustainability consulting that didn't exist 5 years ago? We know that this is a changing field. We know that there's a lot happening. How have you seen this progression over the past period?
Yeah, thank you. As you were saying, it's an exciting time because I think some of the key trends we're seeing are, one is just convergence, right? We're seeing a lot more need for interdisciplinary work to meet the challenges that are growing in complexity. And so I think we're seeing a lot more cross-sector collaboration, folks who have very mixed and diverse backgrounds coming into this space. So let's say that's one key trend, convergence, and having more interdisciplinary roles. And then a second key trend is that we have tech and data enablement, right? That's just like accelerated exponentially in the past few years. And so there's always been some level of, data analytics and technology implementation, as we think about cities, as we think about urban transformation. But the level of tech advancement in the past few years has just exploded. And that's, I think, really changing the space. And so when you think about, being able to use AI and sensor technology to manage resources, for monitoring, for better public service delivery, those skills and those types of roles, data analytics, digital solutions are I think what we're going to see a lot more of. We're already seeing a lot, and we're going to see a lot more of moving forward. So I'd say those are the two things that are emerging and that I think are really exciting opportunities.
Fantastic. And we will dive deeper, particularly on the technology side of this. Mokena, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the progression that you've seen in the past period.
I think Courtney's point about convergence is significant because it happens really in two respects. It's the convergence of the problems that are being faced in terms of urban development and sustainability, but also convergence in the solution sets. The why I use this sort of framing is that historically what we'd find is that if there was an urban problem, one particular discipline would have the solution for it. As Courtney has described, we have to be increasingly interdisciplinary. We can't solve urban poverty without understanding water infrastructure, as well as job creation, as well as urban form and even public transport. So the solution sets that are going to be required to address these now common problems require diverse thinking, diverse approaches, and even a multi-pronged approach to formulating them. So although we're seeing this, we're also not seeing enough understanding of how are these decisions financed. We're finding that legislators and the way that municipalities are run, which are inherently silo-driven, sometimes don't have the instruments to work in an interdisciplinary fashion, or at least to implement in an interdisciplinary fashion. So what we're beginning to find is that increasingly that this convergence is forcing all participants to work differently. Politicians find that they can't have the easy soundbite to solve a problem because the solution is now complex. And likewise, engineers or financiers who might have a spreadsheet that used to work maybe 10, 20 years ago to solve a problem now has a whole range of externalities that are either poorly understood or not just poorly understood, they might be understood, but then the question is, how do you address those externalities? For example, air quality in the city, and how, asthma and public transport and urbanization relate is a new way of thinking about urban sustainability.
Thank you for sharing that. So digging deeper about the concept of interdisciplinary knowledge, maybe you can, Mokeka, tell us.
I would. It's something I care about quite deeply, and I actually make reference to transdisciplinary knowledge, which is a step up from inter. Because in many ways, when we think of interdisciplinary knowledge, the common framing is getting an architect to, let's say, talk to an engineer, to maybe talk to an urban planner. But in some ways, that's somewhat common. A transdisciplinary problem is somewhat more systemic. So if we say that, for example, in a city, we are concerned, again, to make the point about respiratory disease, that is a transdisciplinary problem because that will tie into emissions, that could tie into lifestyle, that could tie into the distribution of trees. So that might speak to landscape architects, and it might even tie into the health industry and what's available. So I think that increasingly to solve the challenges of urban environments, our problems are even transdisciplinary. To an extent, they're interdisciplinary, but even then, an interdisciplinary team might need to work with a botanist, might need to work with a lawyer, might need to work with an insurance actuary to be able to do their work. And that takes it beyond the traditional framing of inter and much more into transdisciplinary action.
Courtney, as somebody in the consulting field, I'm sure you face this regularly. Like you work with governments, you work with, I guess, governments, right? And this seems to be it's a very complex problem.
Definitely.
How do you
And I would say,
this?
yeah, I would say that in addition, I couldn't agree more with what Mokena said. In addition to the transdisciplinary nature of the problems and the needs for the solutions, there's also, I would say, a set of enabling capabilities that are really key, right? So the more of a functional skill set versus technical, that I think is one of the reasons why you see so many consultants in this work, right? Because in addition to bringing the architects and the landscape folks and the health specialists and the transportation experts together, you also need someone who knows how to mobilize and manage finances to address the huge financing gaps. You need folks who can develop and effectively manage projects. You need someone who can convene those stakeholders, understand kind of each of their perspectives and how to align incentives to get to productive partnerships. So that's, a strategic facilitation and coordination skill set to help all of those different parties share data, speak the same language, and have a structured process for decision making. And so it's some of those things sound kind of fluffy and hard to define, but you can't just have 30 technical experts from different disciplines in a room and expect a positive outcome, right? And so I think there's a role there for consultants who have those kind of strategic coordination and facilitation skills to actually get to those transdisciplinary solutions. And then I'd say on top of that, as a consultant, you're also exposed to a lot of different industries, clients, challenges. And so you're able to kind of bring in that experience and help to connect those dots where, people are used to kind of working in their lane and their silos. You're able to kind of look up and connect the dots and bring, unlikely partners together.
Earlier on, when we first started this discussion, one of the other topics that you mentioned is technology. I'm wondering, as you're talking about the interdisciplinary complexities of solving or getting this working, I'm wondering, has technology been an important instrument in helping to, I guess, go through all the clutter, or like helping get all of these different factors together to come to a solution? Courtney, I'd love to hear from you.
I think yes and no. I mean, technology definitely is an enabler in terms of like the amount of data we can gather and the different ways we can gather that data. But at the core, you're still dealing with people, and you're still dealing with different perspectives and the need to kind of bring people together. I would say in addition to data generation and collection, the ability to transpose different layers of different types of data is very helpful. So like creating dashboards to help decision makers have a summary, not just of the data, but the so what, the insights to help with their decision making. So that's another key role, right? And a reason why kind of this transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary skill set is so important, because you need folks who kind of can understand, the different types of data coming in and know how to layer them and know how to connect those dots and present something that is actually actionable, which is very hard to do. And the volume of data we now have access to in some instances actually sometimes makes it harder to do that. And so it's a good problem, but definitely a lot more, work needed to sort through it.
Mokena, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and maybe also like I want to add in a layer of AI to this, and Courtney, you'll get a chance after Mokena to weigh in on, because AI, we're hearing AI a lot. A lot of the points that you mentioned, Courtney, the layers of complexity of data, going through all of that, understanding different people. A lot of people can argue that AI can be a tool to kind of bridge that. Mokena, I'd love to hear your thoughts first on technology, more specifically on AI. And then Courtney, I'd love to also hear after Mokena, get your thoughts on AI and how that's coming into the industry and this space.
Sure. This is a very hot space for those of us in academia where we teach urban planning, urban design, and architecture, because in many ways, technology and even AI, it has been argued that it's been starting to take out decision-making processes, which are actually quite important to our disciplines, or even for collaboration. And I definitely think that there's a bit of tension there about how do we use the technology in a strategic and thoughtful way to kind of reinforce Courtney's point. one of the things that I think is significant is that in terms of technology, there's a number of things. First of all, to recognize that technology is unevenly distributed. So we might have a particular solution in one city or one location that has the power, the resources, the data analytics, the data scientists to do the work, but you might be in a city in a lower income country where that technology is not present. So at some point, we have to start to imagine what happens when the technology is not there. You still have to be able to provide a service, provide expertise, and so on. So I always talk about the relationship between technology and principles and technology and values. Because in many ways, you can work with a community, you can do stakeholder management with societies that don't have access to technology, but you can find a common ground in terms of urban impacts from the perspective of values and let's call it urban principles. And I think those principles can actually go all the way to the top of government. And why I say that is that when we have these data points, sometimes there's a temptation to say the data says this, therefore we must automatically do that. Strategic insight is such an important part of being able to parse the data and be able to make thoughtful decisions. And that's where values and principles come into play. So it is a bit of a both and situation to kind of paraphrase my colleague Courtney. I think the idea that technology automatically gives us solutions is not the case. I always tell my students, make the example of some of the most amazing architectural projects were designed with candlelight and charcoal 400 years ago. So if they could do it, you can do it now. So there's our capacity to imagine what an urban environment needs to look like is enabled by technology, but should not be dictated by it. Having said that, and moving to the AI piece right now, AI is wonderful in so many respects. It allows us to create digital cities, digital twins. We can do iterations on public infrastructure. We can even map the intersection between infrastructure investment and let's call it ecological impact. The trick here is not so much for the data to drive decision making, but for AI to inform decision making. And I think the difficulty with that is that for somebody who you could imagine a client or let's say a politician or even a funder wanting a quick solution, the AI can give the illusion that you now have the answer. The ability to say the AI is saying this or the data is saying that, but what are the insights? What are the social implications? What are the intangibles that sometimes AI actually can't measure? For example, externalities. We spoke before about complex problems. I'll give a very short story and then I'll hand over the mic. During the 1970s and 80s, there was a concern about the cost of cleaning up cities. So many cities decided to plant male trees as opposed to having male and female trees, with the idea that there would be no, reproduction, and that would then reduce the waste. The problem is that these male trees now produce a lot of pollen. So now we're finding out that many of these cities are the cities that have extreme respiratory problems, which means that now there's increased hospitalization and asthma because of urban planning and frankly, somebody trying to save money on cleaning sidewalks in the 1970s. We now have the external cost of cities which have extreme pollen, sinusitis, etc. So AI, unless you're able to map and understand those complexities upfront, if you were to ask AI what is the most efficient or cost-efficient tree to put in a city, it might not map out those externalities. So I think we have to be very cautious about what do we ask AI to do? Yeah. And also whatever it gives back to us, to be cognizant that we're talking about very complex systems where a land use planning decision can have a health outcome that is unforeseen, and it's very difficult for AI in this moment to be able to model those externalities. And that's where the human dimension becomes not only critical, but essential to have good urban planning decision-making processes.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think, systems thinking is kind of what we're talking about here, having that mindset of, acknowledging that there's complexity, there's interconnection, acknowledging that there are always going to be these externalities, these domino effects to every action, and trying to kind of map those out. And that in order to address, issues or change behaviors, at the surface of a problem. You need to kind of go down several layers and understand the interconnections beneath the surface. And I think all of that work requires human intelligence before we then use AI or any tech solution as an enabler. One of my favorite examples of one of my favorite examples of using AI in an urban setting is this group that is using GIS imagery and machine learning to map spatial inequities between wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods and townships in South Africa to improve, the data that is available for policymaking. Because oftentimes the way that the neighborhoods and the townships are grouped in their political denominations means that the townships are not actually there's not enough data from the townships to really understand the level of public service or lack thereof, right? And so all of that, thoughtfulness in the use of technology is, a prerequisite, I think. There's, you have to kind of have an understanding of the social dynamics, the political dynamics, the policy environment, in order to even frame the problem and then, use technology to help address it.
That's a cool project. Mokena, do you have any cool or interesting projects that you've heard of or have worked on recently that shows examples of innovation in urban sustainability?
Well, I hope this is not going to turn into a cool competition, because then I defer to Courtney's to Courtney's proposal. But I'll give a couple of examples. So going back to GIS and machine learning, understanding landscapes and knowing where to plant trees in order to increase, let's call it the carbon impact, or let's call it the carbon storage of a particular forest, taking into account slope so that you actually reduce runoff, and then intersecting that with communities to see what communities could benefit from the maintenance, or let's call it the taking care of these particular forests, is an amazing example of where technology and society can start to interact. But also we can look at it in terms of building management and components, optimizing the amount of materials that we use to make a building, but not just understanding that optimization, but understanding where those materials come from. So part of my work is about understanding supply chain and logistics. So where does the wood come from? Which forest? Is it better to use a local wood versus a wood that might be coming, from a different country? Mapping those things out so that you can be able to understand the carbon content or the carbon impact of a particular building. And I think AI and technology is starting to play a big role in modeling these complexities. And if you take it from the level of the building to the level of the city, that becomes particularly fascinating. So when we start to think about how can we reduce the carbon footprint of a New York or a London, understanding its biomass, understanding its flows, we're not quite there yet, but I foresee a future where there'll be an overlap between logistics management, urban development, and indeed the energy profile of cities. And in many ways, that data crunching is beyond the human mind to immediately conceive, but we can start to map out what are the key drivers that can actually make cities become carbon sinks and storages as opposed to carbon polluters, as an example. Yeah.
Let me tell you, very cool as well, to be honest. I'm actually, it's interesting. You both were a bit hesitant when I talked about technology, right? Because you said there was a bigger problem, you need the human element, but the examples that you both gave had quite a lot of technical elements incorporated into that, and that because we're advancing technologically, we're able to do a lot more, which is actually, again, very cool.
If I may, Ahmed, I think you're right. I think Courtney and I share being probably in the room where the technology is sometimes seen as the answer, and we've probably been the ones where we've had to be the strategy facilitators. So that's probably where it's coming from. But I do want to add on to what you're suggesting. These new opportunities are pointing out new skill sets, or rather adjustments to current skill sets, which is an amazing opportunity, but it can be scary for some. So now when we have urban planning, and I talk to urban planners who historically would look at thousands of years of urban history, and that would be the basis for urban planning. But now to say we're going to generate a digital twin and we're going to model a city in a virtual environment, and we're going to use that to inform and create iterations of different scenarios for how a city could work. For some, that's a new thing. So that means they now have to work with data teams. They now have to work with computational modelers and machine learning teams, whereas traditionally there'd be very different instruments. So I think there's a whole range of also workforce opportunities and expertise to be able to manage these technologies, but to also make the transdisciplinary conversation even more robust. And I think that's not spoken enough about, the amount of jobs that are going to be required and enabled by this evolution.
And I do want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about that. But before I do, I just want to like conclude the last section because you've mentioned systems thinking, right? Courtney, you've mentioned system thinking. Mokena, you've mentioned, and that makes sense when you look at the complexities of urban planning and urban development. It makes sense to be thinking in terms of systems thinking. I'd love to hear from both of you, and maybe Courtney, we could start with you. How important is system thinking in addressing urban sustainability challenges in today's urban environments?
I think it's critical. It's so important. It's basically what we've been talking about, right? This transdisciplinary set of skills and perspectives, acknowledging that that there is complexity, that there's interconnection, and it's not only needed to get to a viable solution to these complex problems, but it's needed for the the solutions themselves to last, to be sustainable, and to not create more problems.
Right.
And so there are all kinds of very complex models for systems thinking, but I think that at its core, it's really just again acknowledging complexity, and really understanding the connections between, you know, different systems and different components within each system. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Mokena to elaborate.
Well, I can't agree more. All I would say is that one of the difficulties of any community, or let's say the average distribution of people, is that not everybody's inclined to understand or engage at a systemic level. So the difficulty that we have right now is, as the world becomes smaller because of growing, populations, reduced resources, etc., a systems thinker would probably not have been critical for a government to consider maybe 100 years ago. Now it's vital. And the difficulty is trying to make that sort of step change, because our legislative processes, the way we make decisions and so on, still comes from a siloed culture. It doesn't come from a systems thinking perspective. And I think the big gap is really around how do we get our decision-making processes to respond to that. And I'll make a very short example. If you consider climate change, which is essentially a systemic issue, you can't tackle climate change, which is part of this polycrisis, by addressing one particular thing. It requires a multi-pronged approach. But if our governments and our participatory political processes are such that people are looking for the silver bullet to solve the problem, it's going to take us away from systemic solutions. Or alternatively, if people say, we did this one thing, so why isn't this working? And you have to explain to them, you can't solve climate change through any one action, but through a series of actions. That becomes a challenge. So I think we as humans, we're in a very unique time as a species, given our impact on the planet, given our density. We cannot avoid systems thinking, and we have to adjust our education, our decision-making processes. The way we even frame the problem, as Courtney has described, needs to be seen as a field. Problems are now fields. Problems are no longer singular. And likewise, solutions require entering this field from different angles and getting the average person to see that as not being mischievous or trying to make the problem sound more complicated than it is has huge societal and political implications. So we haven't even discussed the role of the social sciences and people who are not in the technical world, and how do they interface with complexity, and how do we bring them on board? And they're the primary beneficiaries of this. And I think there's a lot of socio-political work to be done about making these processes relevant to everybody and not just those in the technical rooms.
Thank you so I did want to jump into the skill set, but I think I just want to ask one more question, not on the social element of this, but more on the economic side of this, right? Because I think oftentimes economic development and sustainability don't see eye to eye, right? They're kind of, in a sense, they can be on opposing sides of this. So before moving on to the skill sets, which I wanted to hear from you guys, and Mokena, maybe you can start. How do you balance economic development with environmental and social sustainability in the urban projects, right? And talking of systems thinking, talking about complexity,
I know.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm going to try and simplify very complex problems. So first of all, I've been in so many rooms where I would talk about sustainability, and the community say, we don't want to hear about nature, we want to hear about jobs. So if you take that framing, it almost implies that you have to choose. So the first thing that I always do is to say that this is not a binary condition, that in fact, as we transition towards a climate smart planet, there are more jobs, more skills, more opportunities coming out of it. So it's not so much a choice that in order to have jobs, you have to sacrifice nature. Now, I say this coming from particularly a continent where it's often seen that we need to pollute and create jobs. And then once we've got jobs, we can stop polluting. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that has been said in a number of African countries, to say that it's not our job to save the planet. It's the global north that's producing the waste. They must deal with it. I think we need to get to a point where we understand that very often the places that are most vulnerable to environmental degradation are the places which have the highest poverty and need for job creation. And those things are a vicious circle. So the idea that somehow that we can pollute ourselves to prosperity is not true. In fact, many of the climate impacts we're seeing, whether it's extreme weather patterns, flooding, droughts, changing patterns which are affecting food security, it's intimately related to the question of sustainability. So I actually try and make the argument that they are actually interconnected, and green jobs are the future, and that green growth is the future, and that on the contrary, that the externalities which are giving us this difficult life that we have are actually created by polluting economies. So having a job in the short term, which in the long term is detrimental to your life, your family, etc., means that we might need to rethink the short-term versus long-term implications. It's unsatisfactory in some places.
Trees, macaco. Planting trees.
Right? Yeah. But it's a message we have to keep pushing. I'll hand over the mic just now. A friend of mine, we had the same conversation. He was raising funds for investment in South Africa and coming to New York, and said he wanted to meet with investors. And I said to him, fantastic, I know a number of green economy investors. He says, no, we just want jobs. I said, no, you don't understand. Capital here is now wanting to also to do good. So if you just want to raise funds for a coal power station, you're not going to find the same amount of attention for that unless you say, I'd like to do a renewable biogas digester at a microgrid scale for the following city. Capital will come. So increasingly, it's also important to make the case that capital is now flowing towards environmental goods and moving away from detrimental sectors, relatively speaking. Yeah. Well, over to you, Courtney.
I agree that there's reason for optimism. Like I think just looking at the African continent last year with the Nairobi Declaration on Climate Change, we're seeing kind of a paradigm shift coming out of leaders right on the continent saying, okay, yes, Africa, the continent, is in many ways a victim, right? The emissions are generally low, but we bear an disproportionate burden of the impacts of climate change. But that's not the full story. We need to actually think of ourselves as a hub for solutions, right? Of carbon sinks, and and yeah, and so I think that there's room for optimism that, there's a shift in thinking around this not being a binary, right? You can develop, you can advance towards your development goals while also aspiring for, a net neutral or even net negative
Yeah.
trajectory. And I think how do you actually do that? It's helping people understand that, it's not this binary, but also speaking the language of the people that you're talking to, right? So understanding what is driving them, their business drivers and motivations, and being able to speak in that language and align incentives. So if someone is really just focused on jobs, like give them the data around jobs,
Mm.
that doesn't mean that those jobs, there are other benefits, but if that's what their primary motivation is, then start with that. And so I think a lot of what I do when I'm working with public sector clients, and trying to help them engage private sector, is build up that capacity to speak the language, right, of businesses that are looking for those specific outcomes.
I wanted to just shift a little bit to we mentioned we have 7 minutes to go, so not too much time. But you both mentioned new skills and technology in order to capitalize and to be able to move forward. There's new skills that you guys are seeing in your respective areas. I'd love to just get a sense from that. And this is particularly interesting for our audience. Many of our audience are new in this industry. Many of them are wanting to possibly transition into this industry. And I think rightfully so in Africa in particular, there is a lot of opportunities, particularly also within the urban planning and urban sustainability spaces. Courtney, could you give us a sense of what these skill sets that you're seeing are, and maybe give us some ideas on how one could develop those?
Yes, and so I'll speak from, my own experience as more of a generalist, right? That whether you're, kind of on a generalist track like me or you're specializing, I think it's really important to be what I call professionally multilingual. So meaning that you understand some key concepts and some key terms and kind of the language from different sectors that are touching whatever issue you're interested in, so that you can connect those dots more easily. It's like being able to code switch or, exchange simple greetings in another language, right? It facilitates easier communication and collaboration. And I think, as we've been saying, it's more likely that in your career you're going to be collaborating with people across areas of expertise. And so having that facility is really important. It's also really important that you understand data. You don't necessarily need to be, a hardcore data scientist, or you can be, but if you're not, having a baseline of understanding of, all of the data analytics tools that are available, AI, what it is and isn't. We talked about, not leaning too heavily on tech solutions, but really understanding their limitations, I think is important.
Right.
And, if you are a generalist or a specialist on a team working with data scientists, you have to be able to understand their processes, to make sure that you're, providing the right inputs at the right time, and, making sure that you're ending up with quality outputs. And then this isn't so much a skill set, but just like a tip as you navigate your careers. I think it's really important to not be insular. So, create and cultivate a diverse and broad network of folks outside of your area of expertise, or if you're a generalist in a lot of different areas of expertise. so that you're continuing to learn. And as you need those different perspectives, you can kind of loop people in and lean on them. Because again, these problems and challenges that we're facing are complex. And so you need really diverse perspectives to tackle them.
Mokena, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And in academia, you maybe deal with more, I guess, newer people into this industry. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just smiling as Courtney was speaking because I'm both a generalist and a specialist. I mean, I'm an architect and an urban planner. I've designed over 100 buildings. I've led teams with engineers. I've worked with, so I come from a very specialized discipline and a discipline background. And I'll speak first to the specialist and I'll jump back to the generalist approach. The one thing that is important, I think, is to ensure that a specialist should not believe that their skills are finite. We have to remain curious. We have to remain open-minded. In many respects, the work that I do now is unrelated to what I studied as an architect. It's unrelated specifically to urban planning. I now operate primarily in the sort of systems thinking space, policy formulation, strategy and assessment, but it comes from a specialist background, which is useful because I can talk to specialists at time, but I can also talk to generalists. But I would not have been able to do that if I thought that my skills were finite. If I had remained within the silo of my community and decided that I'm not interested in these externalities or these other issues. So I think it's very important that even if you're a specialist, to remain curious about things beyond your expertise. Now, what does that mean for academia? There's a big challenge here because undergraduate education is to some degree about specialization. There's a social contract. You come in, I'm paying to be an artist, I'm paying to be an engineer, I'm paying to be a writer. And I think these institutions, in many respects, have a duty to fulfill that contract, right? Mm-hmm. However, in the fulfillment of that contract, how do you ensure that that person has enough curiosity, enough ability, so that once they've moved into postgraduate studies or into the open world, that they're able to be effective, learn, and participate in the types of rooms that Courtney's describing. So this is where I think the nuance in terms of higher education, and it's a challenge because some institutions predicate their value on the transfer of specific knowledge. Others predicate their value in terms of being able to create thinkers. And I think the space in higher academia is to where you can get a blending between those two, between the ability to think beyond one's discipline and the ability to think within the discipline. Now, to bring it back to the generalist piece, this approach to skills is vital. So, of course, there's room for data analytics. Of course, there's room for people with a sense of mathematics that they can be part of the machine learning process. But lawyers can now come into that because now we can start to see the importance of legislation. Social scientists, anthropologists can now have a contribution towards how we think about cities because maybe they have an insight on communities which are not captured by the civil engineering discipline. And equally, politicians who may, hopefully with the best of spirits, want to have impacts on multiple communities, if they can begin to understand urbanism and urban phenomena as a way of engaging constituents to make their lives better, a smart politician would be a good urbanist, right? I mean, there's an easy link there. So I think it's about maintaining curiosity, whether you're a specialist or a generalist. I think it's about educating students and to think beyond the let's call it the finite limits of their skills. Right. There'll always be room for specialists. The world needs them, and we will continue to need them. But they need to work with others. And I think it's about understanding that specialization is not enough. I think it's increasingly many of the mistakes we've had, I think because sometimes specialization tends to reduce the externalities and to narrowly define a problem. And that's how it defines success. But once you shift the problem, it's completely disastrous. So that's my concern is we need to start to change the value system for our education sector and kind of go back to a more classical Renaissance style basic education for everybody.
Mokena and Courtney, we're at time, actually, just a little bit over time, but just for everybody that's attending with us, I wanted to just encourage you. There's the next session coming up on in our conference is actually very relevant to this point that we were just talking about. The session is green skills for the future, diverse career paths, emerging roles, and employer expectations. So Teresia and Garande will be leading that session. I do suggest if what Mokena and Courtney has sparked your interest today, please move on to that next session, because there you can dive deeper about the skill sets, what employers are looking for, and learn more about that. Mokena and Courtney, thank you guys so much. I mean, there's so much to unpack here. I think we've barely touched the surface on this topic, but I think hopefully it's captured the interest and attention of some of our listeners to want to dive deeper into this space. Thank you very much, both of you, for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me as well. And thank you, McKenna. Nice talking to you.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you, Courtney. Wonderful session, and I learned even more. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.